The wind tore through the pines with a violence Elena Whitfield had never felt before, and somewhere beneath the roar of the storm, she heard something that did not belong to the wind at all. A cry. Small, broken, desperate. She stood frozen on the porch of her cabin, rain slashing sideways across her face, her heart slamming against her ribs. The sound came again, thinner this time, as if whatever made it was losing the strength to keep making it. She grabbed the old lantern hanging by the door, pulled her coat tight, and stepped straight into the storm, without a single thought for her own safety. The forest at night was a different world. Trees she knew by daylight had become looming shapes, their branches thrashing overhead like arms reaching for her. Mud sucked at her boots with every step. She pushed forward toward the sound, following it through the dark, past the fallen oak that marked the edge of her land, down into the ravine where the storm water was already rising in a furious brown torrent. The cry came a third time, and this time it was close. She raised the lantern and saw them. 3 small shapes huddled together on a narrow ledge of rock, half a foot above the rising water, shivering so hard their tiny bodies blurred in the lantern light. Wolf pups. Newborn, barely able to stand, their fur soaked flat against their skin, their eyes squeezed shut against the rain. One of them tried to cry out again but only managed a weak, rasping whimper. Elena did not hesitate. She half slid, half climbed down the muddy slope, her boots losing traction twice before she caught herself on a jutting root. The water was already lapping at the ledge when she reached them. She scooped up the nearest pup first, tucking it inside her coat against her chest, then the second, then the third, cradling all 3 against her body, as the ravine roared beneath her. Climbing back up was harder than climbing down. Her arms shook with the effort of holding the pups steady, while her legs fought the slick mud, and twice she nearly slipped back toward the churning water. When she finally hauled herself over the top of the ravine, she lay there for a moment, gasping, rain pouring over her, 3 tiny heartbeats pressed against her own. She did not know, in that moment, whose pups she was carrying. She did not know what she had just pulled out of the dark. She only knew they were alive, and that they would not survive the night without her. The walk back to the cabin felt endless. The storm did not let up, and the pups had gone eerily still against her chest, their small bodies trembling less now, which frightened her more than their crying had. By the time she pushed through her front door and set them down near the fire, she was soaked to the bone and shaking almost as badly as they were. She toweled them dry with quick, careful hands, checking each one over. 3 pups. 2 with fur so dark it looked black in the firelight, and 1 smaller pup with a coat the color of pale silver, almost white. All 3 were breathing, but weakly. She spent the rest of that night without sleep. She warmed goat milk on the stove, testing the temperature on her wrist the way she remembered her mother doing decades ago with orphaned lambs. She fed each pup from a small dropper, 1 drop at a time, coaxing their tiny mouths open when they were too exhausted to try on their own. The silver pup was the weakest, and twice Elena thought she had lost him, only for his ribs to rise again in a shallow, stubborn breath. She held him against her neck for warmth long after the others had settled, whispering to him without even realizing she was doing it, the same way she used to whisper to the sick animals brought to her small rescue center. By the time gray morning light crept through the windows, all 3 pups were sleeping, curled together in a nest of towels near the fire, their small chests rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. Elena sat on the floor beside them, her back against the couch, too tired to move, watching them with something that felt strangely like relief and love all at once, even though she had known them for less than a night. She had lived alone at the edge of the forest for 3 years, ever since she took over the small wildlife rescue her mother had built with her own hands. It was quiet work, mostly injured birds, orphaned rabbits, the occasional fox caught in old farm equipment. She had never in all that time found wolf pups, not once. Wolves in this region kept far from people, deep in territory that locals whispered about but rarely entered. The nearest town, Ashford Hollow, was a good hour's drive away, and even the hunters who came through in autumn spoke carefully about the northern woods, as if naming them too loudly might draw attention they did not want. Elena had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in Ashford Hollow had. Stories about a wolf larger than any recorded in the region, one that moved through the trees like a shadow, and was said to command every pack for 50 miles in every direction. People called him the Alpha King, half in jest, half in genuine unease, because more than one hunter had returned from the northern woods, swearing they had seen eyes watching them from the dark that were far too intelligent to belong to an ordinary animal. Elena had always assumed it was exaggeration, the kind of tale that grows taller with every retelling in the town's one tavern. But looking down now at the 3 pups sleeping in her living room, she found herself wondering, for the first time, if there might be some truth buried in those stories after all. She pushed the thought aside. Whatever these pups were, wherever they had come from, they needed her now, and that was enough. The days that followed fell into an exhausting but strangely satisfying rhythm. Elena fed the pups every 3 hours, day and night, setting alarms so she would not oversleep and leave them hungry. She learned their personalities quickly. The 2 dark-furred pups, a little bolder than their silver sibling, tumbled over each other constantly, nipping at fingers, at each other, at anything that moved. She named them Birch and Ash, for the trees near where she had found them. The silver pup was quieter, watchful, often the last to eat but the first to notice when Elena entered a room. She called him Frost. By the end of the first week, all 3 were strong enough to walk properly, their legs no longer wobbling beneath them, their eyes fully open and startlingly clear. Elena kept detailed notes in a journal she had used for years to track the animals she cared for, though she found herself writing more personal observations than usual. She wrote about how Frost always positioned himself where he could see the door. She wrote about how Birch and Ash seemed to communicate with small sounds she could not quite place, more complex than the simple whimpers and yips she expected from pups their age. She wrote, then crossed out, then wrote again, a line that unsettled her every time she looked at it. These are not ordinary wolves. She told herself it was simply because she had never raised wolf pups before, that she had nothing to compare their behavior against. But some nights when she sat with them by the fire and one of them would go suddenly still, ears pricked toward the tree line outside, staring at something she could not see or hear, a small chill would run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was on one of those nights, nearly 2 weeks after she found them, that Elena began to sing. She had not planned it. The pups had been restless that evening, more so than usual, whining and pacing near the window in a way that unsettled her. Nothing she tried seemed to calm them, not food, not warmth, not the soft blankets she had washed and dried especially for them. Out of something close to desperation, she began to hum, quietly at first, an old melody her mother used to sing to her when she was small and could not sleep. The tune had no real name that Elena knew of. Something passed down without a title, soft and slow, rising and falling like a lullaby carried on wind. The effect was immediate. Birch stopped pacing first, his small body sinking down onto the blanket. Ash followed a moment later, pressing close against his brother. Frost, who had been standing rigid by the window, turned his head toward Elena, watched her for a long moment with those clear, pale eyes, and then padded over and curled against her leg, his trembling finally easing. Elena kept singing, the words half remembered, filling in the gaps with soft sounds that carried the same gentle rhythm. She sang until all 3 pups were asleep, their small bodies rising and falling in unison, peaceful at last. She sat there a long while afterward, staring into the fire, the last notes of the lullaby still hanging faintly in the room. She did not know that the window she sat near was not fully closed, that a gap along its old wooden frame let sound slip out into the night far more easily than she realized. She did not know that beyond the tree line, further than any ordinary animal should have been able to hear, something enormous and silent had gone completely still, every sense straining toward the faint, familiar sound of a voice, carrying an old and gentle song. She did not know that a pair of golden eyes, sharp with a grief so deep it had worn a permanent ache into a heart far larger than any wolf's heart should be, had turned toward her cabin with sudden, desperate attention. Elena only knew that the pups slept soundly that night, and so, for the first time in 2 exhausting weeks, did she. Over the following days, singing became part of her ritual with them. Each evening, once the pups had been fed and settled, she would sit near the fire and sing softly, sometimes her mother's lullaby, sometimes tunes she made up as she went along, simple and repetitive, easy for young minds to settle into. She noticed the pups responded most strongly to the old lullaby, the one with no name, and so she returned to it most nights, letting the familiar melody fill the small cabin. She began to notice other things too, things that pulled at the edges of her attention, even when she tried to focus on simpler explanations. The pups grew far faster than she expected, their bodies filling out with a strength that seemed almost unnatural for their age. Their eyes held an alertness that felt less like animal instinct and more like understanding. Once, when she dropped a metal bowl and it clattered loudly against the floor, all three pups turned toward the sound at the exact same instant, moving with a coordination that made the hair on her arms rise. And then there were the nights she felt watched. It began as a vague unease, the kind she might have dismissed if it happened only once. But it kept happening. She would step outside to bring in firewood and feel a prickling awareness along the back of her neck, as if eyes were fixed on her from somewhere in the dark tree line. She would check the perimeter of her small property with her flashlight, find nothing, and go back inside telling herself it was nerves, exhaustion, the natural jumpiness of living alone at the edge of a wild forest. But the feeling never fully left her, and some mornings, she found tracks in the mud near her fence line, tracks far larger than any wolf print she had ever seen in her years running the rescue. She did not tell anyone in Ashford Hollow about the pups. Something instinctive told her to keep them quiet, to keep this discovery close, though she could not have explained exactly why if anyone had asked. Perhaps it was simply that she had grown attached to them faster than she expected, and some part of her feared what people in town might say, or do, if they learned an untrained woman was raising 3 wolf pups alone in an isolated cabin. Perhaps it was something else entirely, some instinct she did not yet have words for. Whatever the reason, she kept her secret, and every night, unaware, she sang her lullaby into the dark, and every night, unseen, something massive and grieving crept a little closer through the trees to listen. 3 weeks after she found them, Elena woke before dawn to a sound that made her blood run cold. It was not a whimper, not a whine. It was a long, low howl, rising from just beyond her fence line, so deep and resonant that she felt it in the floorboards beneath her bare feet before she consciously registered hearing it at all. She sat bolt upright, heart pounding, and hurried to check on the pups, only to find all 3 of them standing at the window, ears pricked forward, tails held with a stillness that seemed far too composed for creatures their age. A second howl answered the first, from somewhere further off, and then silence fell over the forest, thick and absolute, the kind of silence that feels heavier than any noise. Elena stood in the dark of her living room, 3 pups pressed against her legs, staring out at a tree line that gave away nothing, and for the first time since she had pulled them from that flooding ravine, she let herself fully consider the thought she had been pushing away for weeks. Somewhere out there, something was looking for these pups, something large, something patient, and whatever it was getting closer every single night. She did not sleep again before morning. She sat with the pups until the first gray light broke over the trees, one hand resting on Frost's small back, feeling his tiny heartbeat steady beneath her palm, and she made herself a quiet promise that whatever came for them, she would not let it take them without a fight, though she had no idea yet just how impossible, and how unnecessary, that fight would turn out to be. The morning after the howls, Elena walked the fence line at first light, with a mug of coffee going cold in her hand, searching for any sign of what had come so close in the dark. She found the tracks almost immediately, pressed deep into the soft mud near the old oak stump, larger than her own spread hand, the claw marks sharp and unmistakable. Her breath caught. She had handled canine tracks before, coyotes, foxes, even the occasional wolf print from animals passing through years ago, but nothing came close to this size. Whatever left this print stood taller at the shoulder than most large dogs stood at the head. She crouched beside it, studying the impression, and noticed something else that unsettled her even more. The print was fresh, the edges still sharp and undisturbed by rain, which meant whatever made it had stood there recently, close enough to her cabin to be within easy sight of her windows. She glanced up instinctively toward the tree line, half expecting to see something staring back, but found only shifting shadows and the gentle sway of branches in the morning wind. Back inside, she found the pups awake and unusually subdued, none of their usual tumbling and nipping at each other. Frost sat by the window again, exactly where he had stood during the howls, watching the trees with a patience that seemed impossible for a creature only a few weeks old. Elena sat down heavily on the floor beside him, running a hand along his soft fur, and voiced the question that had been building in her mind for days. "What are you 3, really?" she asked quietly, more to herself than to the pup. though Frost turned his pale eyes toward her as if he understood every word. She spent that afternoon at her desk, pulling out old books on wolf biology that she had collected over her years running the rescue, cross-referencing everything she could find about size, growth rates, coloring, behavior. Nothing matched what she was observing. The growth rate alone should have taken months to reach the stage the pups had reached in mere weeks. She found herself staring at old, half-forgotten folklore sections, in one worn textbook, passages about legendary wolf bloodlines said to carry intelligence and power far beyond ordinary animals, passages she had always dismissed as regional myth, used to explain unusually large predator sightings. Now, watching Birch and Ash chase each other with an almost playful strategy that felt too calculated for pups their age, she was no longer certain what to dismiss and what to take seriously. That evening, despite everything, she sang to them again. It had become as much a comfort to her as it clearly was to them, a small ritual of normalcy, in the middle of a situation that felt increasingly anything but normal. She sat by the fire, pulled a blanket around her shoulders, and let the old lullaby fill the cabin, her voice soft and steady, even though her mind buzzed with unanswered questions. She did not know that just beyond her fence line, hidden perfectly in shadow, an enormous wolf lay pressed flat against the cold ground, golden eyes half closed, listening to a voice that reminded him, note for note, of a song his own mate used to hum to their pups before the storm took them from him. She did not know that the ache in his chest, the one that had not eased in 3 long weeks, had finally, for the first time, begun to loosen just slightly, not because his pain was gone, but because for the first time since the flood, he knew exactly where his children were, and that whoever kept them safe, sang to them, with a gentleness that told him everything he needed to know about her intentions, even before he ever worked up the courage to reveal himself. The howls did not return the following night, nor the night after that. Instead, Elena began to notice smaller signs, quieter ones. A dead rabbit left neatly at the edge of her property line one morning, far too deliberately placed to be a natural kill left behind by a passing predator. Broken branches near the fence, arranged almost like a path leading toward her cabin and then away again, as if something had paced back and forth, deciding whether to come closer. She found herself checking the tree line more often, not entirely out of fear anymore, but out of a strange, growing curiosity that unsettled her almost as much as the fear had. The pups, meanwhile, continued to grow at their startling pace. By the end of the 4th week, Birch and Ash had both surpassed the size Elena would have expected from wolves twice their actual age, their coats thickening into a rich, healthy black that shone under the firelight. Frost grew more slowly than his siblings, but remained the most alert of the 3, often the first to notice sounds outside long before Elena herself heard anything at all. One evening, as Elena prepared their food in the small kitchen, she heard a soft, unfamiliar sound from the living room, distinct from the usual play noises the pups made. She hurried in to check, and found all 3 pups standing perfectly still at the window again. But this time, unlike before, they were not merely staring into the dark. Their tails were low, relaxed, almost welcoming, and small, happy sounds rumbled from deep in their throats, sounds she had never heard them make before, sounds that reminded her uncomfortably of greeting, not warning. She approached the window slowly, and peered out into the darkening tree line, her heart climbing into her throat. For a fraction of a second, just at the edge of where the last daylight faded into shadow, she thought she saw 2 points of golden light staring back at her, low to the ground, unmoving, watching. Then they were gone, vanished into the dark so quickly, she almost convinced herself she had imagined them. Almost. She did not sleep well that night, replaying the image over and over in her mind, but the pups slept peacefully beside her, more peacefully than they had in days, their small bodies relaxed and unbothered in a way that told her, on some level she could not yet fully explain to herself, that whatever had been watching them was not a threat at all. It was something else entirely, something that had been waiting, patient and heartbroken, for exactly this chance to finally be close to them again. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Elena had made a decision, though she did not fully understand yet what it would lead to. Whatever was out there in the dark, watching her cabin with such quiet, aching patience, she was no longer going to simply hide from it. If it wanted her pups, it was going to have to show itself, and she intended to be ready, one way or another, for whatever answer the forest was finally about to give her. 3 weeks before Elena ever heard that first faint cry in the storm, the forest had already been broken by another kind of violence, one that left no visible wound, but tore through the heart of its largest and most feared creature all the same. Cain had been the undisputed ruler of the northern woods for longer than any wolf in living memory, a creature so large and so commanding that even seasoned hunters spoke of him only in hushed, careful tones. He ruled not through cruelty but through sheer presence, a quiet authority that every pack for 50 miles recognized without ever needing to test it. He had a mate he loved fiercely, and together they had raised 3 pups, born only weeks before the storm, that changed everything. The night the flood came, Cain had been leading a hunting party far from the den, tracking a herd that had wandered further than expected into unfamiliar territory. He remembered the wind picking up first, then the sky turning a sickly greenish-gray that every wild creature in the forest instinctively feared. He remembered breaking away from his hunters and running, faster than he had ever run in his life, back toward the den where his mate and pups waited, but the storm outpaced him. By the time he reached the ravine near their territory, the water was already a roaring brown wall, and the den itself had been swept away entirely, along with everything in it. He searched for 3 days straight, without rest, without food, tearing through the flooded landscape with a desperation that left even his own pack unsettled to witness. He found his mate's body on the 2nd day, carried nearly a mile downstream, and something in him broke that he knew would never fully heal. But he did not find his pups, not their bodies, not any sign that they had drowned, nothing at all, which left him trapped in the cruelest possible place, unable to grieve them fully, because some impossible, stubborn part of him refused to believe they were gone. He searched every day after that, expanding his range further and further from his territory, ignoring the pack members who urged him to accept the loss and return to his duties as their leader. He barely slept. He barely ate. His closest advisor within the pack, an older wolf named Garrick who had served beside him for years, tried repeatedly to pull him back from the edge of what looked increasingly like self-destruction, but Cain would not listen. He could not listen. Every instinct in his body told him his pups were alive somewhere, and he intended to tear apart the entire forest if that was what it took to find them. It was on one of these long, aimless searches, weeks into his grief, that Cain first caught the scent. Faint, carried on shifting wind, easy to miss entirely, if he had not been so desperately, obsessively attuned to anything that might connect to his missing family. It was the scent of his pups, unmistakable even after all this time, mixed with something else entirely unfamiliar, human, wood smoke. Something warm and comforting that confused every instinct he had. He followed the scent for miles through unfamiliar terrain, his heart pounding harder with every step, until he came within sight of a small cabin at the edge of the forest, lantern light glowing warm and steady through its windows. He did not approach that first night. Everything in his nature told him to be cautious of humans, an instinct built over generations of wolves who had learned, often through painful experience, that human dwellings meant danger. He circled the property from a distance, staying hidden in the tree line, watching the small structure for hours, torn between the overwhelming urge to charge forward and reclaim what was his, and the deeper, more disciplined instinct that had made him a successful leader for so long. Patience, observation, understanding the threat before acting against it. It was during that first long, silent watch that he heard the sound that changed everything. A voice, soft and warm, drifting faintly through a gap in the cabin's window. Singing, a melody that struck something deep and painful in his chest, because it was achingly, impossibly similar to a song his own mate used to hum to their pups on quiet evenings before the storm took her away. He lay frozen at the edge of the tree line, ears straining toward the sound, and felt something in his grief-hardened heart crack open just slightly, letting in the first sliver of something other than pain since he had lost his family. He returned the following night, and the night after that, always staying at a careful distance, always watching, always listening. He confirmed within days that his pups were inside that cabin, alive, growing stronger, cared for with a gentleness he had not expected from a human. He watched the woman move around inside through the windows, tending to his pups with quick, careful hands, feeding them, warming them, and eventually, always, singing to them until they settled into peaceful sleep. Every instinct told him this was wrong, that pups belonged with their pack, with their own kind, not raised inside human walls by human hands. And yet every observation he made told him something entirely different, that these pups were thriving under this woman's care, in a way they might not have survived without her. He remembered finding them the very night after the flood swept everything away, remembered the desperate, days-long search that turned up nothing, and understood with painful clarity that if this woman had not found them exactly when she did, they would not have survived the night in that flooded ravine at all. The realization sat uneasily with him. Gratitude and resentment tangled together in a way he had never experienced before. Gratitude that his pups were alive and thriving. Resentment that a human had succeeded where his own desperate searching had failed. He did not know what to do with these conflicting feelings, so for weeks he simply watched, night after night, staying hidden, learning everything he could about the woman who had unknowingly become the caretaker of his children. He learned her patterns. She woke early, worked tirelessly caring for injured animals throughout the day, and every evening without fail, once the pups had settled, she would sit near the fire and sing. He began timing his nightly visits around that ritual, drawn to it more than he wanted to admit, finding a strange comfort in a voice that reminded him so completely of everything he had lost. It was Garrick, eventually, who noticed his absences had taken on a pattern rather than aimless wandering, and confronted him about it one evening at the edge of pack territory. Kane, uncharacteristically, told him the truth, about the scent trail, about the cabin, about the pups he had found alive after all this time. Garrick's reaction was a mixture of overwhelming relief at the news of the surviving pups, and immediate, sharp concern about a human being involved in their care. "You cannot simply leave them there," Garrick said, pacing in the way he always did when working through a difficult problem. "They belong with the pack, with their own. They are thriving," Kane replied, his voice quieter than Garrick had heard it in weeks. "She has kept them alive when nothing else could have. She is human," Garrick pressed. "It changes nothing about where they belong." Kane did not answer immediately, staring instead toward the direction of the cabin, though it was far out of sight from where they stood. He knew Garrick was not entirely wrong. Every tradition of his kind told him the pups needed to be returned to the pack, raised among wolves, taught the ways of their own kind rather than growing up inside human walls. And yet something about simply taking them, tearing them away from the only steady comfort they had known since the storm, felt as wrong to him as leaving them there indefinitely. "I will decide how to proceed," Kane said finally, in a tone that ended the conversation, though the uncertainty in his own chest told him he had not actually decided anything at all. That night, he returned to his usual place at the edge of Elena's property, lying low in the shadows as the last light faded from the sky. He watched her move about inside, tending to the pups, and felt the familiar ache in his chest when she finally sat down near the fire and began to sing. He closed his eyes and let the melody wash over him, allowing himself, for just a few stolen minutes, to imagine his mate was the one singing instead, that none of the last several weeks had happened at all. It was during this same visit that Kane noticed something that shifted his careful, patient observation into something far more urgent. As Elena sang, one of the pups, the smaller silver one that Kane recognized immediately as the quietest and most alert of his three children, turned his head directly toward the window, toward the exact spot in the tree line where Kane lay hidden. The pup's ears pricked forward, his small body going still, and for a long, breathless moment, Kane was certain his son could sense him there, even through the darkness and distance that should have made detection impossible. He did not move. He barely breathed. And after several long seconds, the pup turned his attention back toward Elena, settling down beside his siblings as the song continued, though something in the way he had reacted told Kane that his children were beginning to sense, even if only faintly, that they were not as alone in that cabin as they might have believed. It was that single moment, more than anything else, that convinced Kane he could not simply watch from a distance forever. Whatever decision he needed to make about his pups, about the woman caring for them, about the delicate balance between his instincts and his gratitude, he needed to make it soon, before circumstances forced his hand in ways he might not be able to control. He had no way of knowing, as he finally rose and slipped back into the deeper darkness of the forest that night, that circumstances were already moving faster than he realized, and that within days, danger far more immediate than any careful decision about tradition or belonging would arrive at Elena's small cabin, danger that would force him out of hiding far sooner, and far more dramatically, than he had ever intended. The truck rolled into Ashford Hollow on a gray afternoon, its bed loaded with heavy steel cages, rifles mounted in a rack across the back window, and two men inside who had traveled nearly 200 miles, chasing nothing more than a rumor. Elena noticed it the moment she pulled into town for supplies, parked outside the tavern where half the locals gathered most afternoons, and something about the way the two men carried themselves as they climbed out, all confidence and swagger, made her stomach tighten with unease, before she even knew why. She learned the reason soon enough. Standing in line at the small general store, she overheard the taller of the two men, a broad-shouldered stranger with a scar cutting across one eyebrow, telling the store clerk about the reason for their visit. They had heard stories, passed along through hunting forums and old contacts in the region, about an enormous wolf roaming the northern woods, one large enough and rare enough to be worth serious money to certain collectors who paid well for trophies nobody else could claim. The man called it the Alpha King, the same nickname the locals used, except in his mouth the word sounded less like folklore and more like a target. Elena's blood ran cold. She kept her face carefully neutral as she paid for her groceries and left, but her mind raced the entire drive home. If these men were telling the truth about their intentions, and if the massive wolf she suspected had been watching her cabin for weeks truly was the same creature they were hunting, then her property, and the pups inside it, might have just become far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She drove home faster than usual, checking her rearview mirror obsessively, though nothing followed her. When she reached the cabin, she found the pups waiting eagerly at the door the way they always did, and she scooped up Frost automatically, holding him a little tighter than usual, her mind still spinning with everything she had overheard in town. That evening, she did not sing right away. Instead, she sat with the pups in her lap, staring at the tree line through the window, wondering how close the danger she had just learned about truly was, and wondering, with a fear that surprised her, what would happen to the massive wolf she had never actually seen clearly if those men found him first. She did not know that Kane, arriving at his usual hidden spot near the tree line that same evening, had picked up an unfamiliar and deeply unwelcome scent drifting through the forest, one that made every muscle in his body tense with immediate alarm. Gunpowder. Machine oil. The distinct, sharp smell of human weaponry that every experienced predator in these woods had learned, through hard lessons passed down over generations, to recognize and fear. He moved cautiously through the trees, following the scent trail with careful, silent steps, and found tire tracks cutting through soft ground barely a mile from Elena's property, fresh enough that whoever left them could not have passed through more than a few hours earlier. His instincts screamed at him to retreat immediately, to pull his pack back from anywhere near this new threat, but a colder, more urgent thought froze him in place instead. If hunters were moving through this territory searching for him specifically, and if his scent trail led as directly to Elena's cabin as his own tracking had led him there weeks earlier, then the woman caring for his pups, and his pups themselves, were now standing directly in the path of danger meant for him. He spent that night circling the perimeter of Elena's property with far more urgency than he had shown in weeks of patient, careful watching, checking every approach, memorizing every possible path an intruder might use to reach the cabin. He found no immediate sign that the hunters had located the exact property yet, but the tire tracks he had discovered told him it was only a matter of time before their search brought them close enough to notice a wildlife rescue nestled at the edge of the very woods they intended to search. The following 2 days passed with an unbearable tension that Elena could not fully explain to herself, though she recognized it clearly enough as fear. She kept the pups closer than usual, avoided her usual walks around the property perimeter, and found herself checking the tree line dozens of times a day, watching for any sign of the hunters she had overheard in town. On the second evening, her fears were confirmed in the worst possible way. She heard the truck's engine long before she saw it, a low growling rumble, working its way down the barely visible dirt track that led toward her property from the main road. She hurried the pups inside, latching windows, though some distant part of her mind recognized how little a few panes of glass would actually protect them if these men came looking for exactly what she suspected they were looking for. She watched from behind a curtain as the truck rolled slowly past the edge of her fence line, moving at a crawl, the two men inside scanning the tree line with the kind of focused attention that told her immediately they were not simply lost travelers. The truck stopped less than 100 yards from her property line. Both men climbed out, rifles slung over their shoulders, and began walking the edge of the woods, studying the ground with the practiced eyes of experienced trackers. Elena's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her own ears, as she watched them examine the same tree line where she had noticed strange tracks and broken branches weeks earlier, exactly the area where she suspected the massive wolf had been keeping watch over the cabin. She made a decision in that moment that surprised even herself. Rather than remaining hidden and hoping the men would simply move on, she stepped outside, standing tall on her porch, and called out to them directly, her voice carrying an authority she did not entirely feel. "This is private property," she said, loud enough to carry across the distance separating them. "You need to leave." The taller man, the same one she had overheard in the general store, turned toward her with an easy, unbothered smile that made her skin crawl. "Just doing a little scouting, ma'am," he called back. "Heard there's some real interesting wildlife out this way. Big wolf, they say. You seen anything like that around here?" "No," Elena lied immediately, keeping her voice steady despite the way her pulse hammered against her throat. "And you're trespassing. I'd appreciate it if you left." The second man, shorter and quieter than his companion, said something low that Elena could not quite hear, and the taller man's smile faded slightly, though he did not move to leave right away. He studied Elena for a long moment, his gaze flicking briefly toward the cabin behind her, and something about the calculating way he looked at her home made her stomach turn. "No trouble intended," he said finally, raising both hands in a gesture of surrender that felt anything but genuine. "We'll head on out. Nice place you got here." They returned to their truck and pulled away slowly, disappearing back down the dirt track the way they had come, but Elena did not feel any real relief as she watched them go. Something in the way the taller man had looked at her cabin told her this was far from over, and she hurried back inside to check on the pups with hands that would not stop shaking. What Elena could not have known was that Kane had been watching the entire confrontation from the tree line, close enough to hear every word exchanged, close enough that every muscle in his body had gone rigid with the effort of forcing himself to remain hidden, rather than charging forward when the hunters approached so near to the woman and pups he had come to think of as his responsibility to protect, regardless of the complicated feelings tangled up in that responsibility. He watched Elena stand her ground against two armed men with a courage that struck him deeply, and he watched the hunters retreat, though his instincts told him, just as clearly as they told Elena, that the danger had not actually passed. That night, for the first time since he began his careful, distant watch over the cabin, Kane did not simply observe from the tree line. He crept closer than he ever had before, close enough that if Elena had glanced out her window at exactly the right moment, she might have finally seen him clearly, instead of catching only fleeting glimpses of golden eyes in the dark. He positioned himself where he could watch both the cabin and the dirt track leading toward the main road, determined to intercept the hunters himself, if they dared return, before he could find another way to protect his family. Inside, Elena spent a sleepless night formulating a plan of her own. She could not simply wait for the hunters to return, and hope her earlier warning had been enough to scare them off permanently. Men like that, driven by money and the promise of a rare trophy, rarely gave up so easily. She decided, sometime in the early hours of the morning, that she needed to drive into Ashford Hollow the next day and speak with the local ranger station, hoping that reporting the hunters' clear intentions to illegally track and kill protected wildlife might bring some official pressure to bear that her own warnings alone could not achieve. She left early the following morning, reluctantly leaving the pups alone in the cabin for the first time since she had found them, locking every door and window carefully before she went. The drive to the ranger station felt longer than usual, her mind consumed with worry about what might happen while she was away, though she told herself the pups would be safe enough locked inside for the few hours her errand would take. She had no way of knowing that the moment her car disappeared down the road, the two hunters, who had not driven far at all the previous evening, but had instead camped just out of sight along a service road half a mile from her property, packed up their gear and began moving on foot directly toward her now unguarded cabin, having watched her leave and correctly assumed this was their best opportunity to search the property thoroughly without her interference. She also had no way of knowing that Kane, still positioned near the tree line where he had kept watch through the night, caught their scent moving toward the cabin almost immediately, and that within seconds of recognizing the danger, every careful, patient instinct that had kept him hidden for weeks vanished entirely, replaced by something far more primal and immediate. His pups were alone inside that cabin. The woman who had kept them alive and safe for weeks was gone, and two armed men were closing in with clear, dangerous intent. He moved through the trees faster than he had moved in years, faster even than the desperate days he spent searching the flooded ravine for his missing pups, closing the distance toward the cabin with a single, overwhelming purpose, driving every powerful stride. Whatever decisions he still needed to make about tradition, about belonging, about the complicated tangle of gratitude and instinct that had kept him hesitating at the edge of Elena's property for weeks, none of it mattered anymore in the face of immediate, direct danger to his children. He would deal with those questions later. Right now, only one thing mattered, and he intended to reach that cabin before the hunters did, whatever it cost him to do it. Inside the cabin, Birch, Ash, and Frost had spent the morning restless and unsettled, pacing between the windows in a way that mirrored the tension Elena had left behind when she drove away. They had grown accustomed to her presence, to the rhythm of her daily care, and her absence combined with something else, some instinct none of them could name, kept all three pups on edge from the moment her car disappeared down the road. It was Frost who noticed the approaching danger first, his small body going rigid near the front window, a low growl building in his throat that sounded far too fierce for a pup his age. Birch and Ash joined him moments later, all three pups pressing close together, ears flat, watching through the glass as two unfamiliar men approached the cabin on foot, moving with the slow, deliberate caution of hunters closing in on a target. The taller man reached the porch first, testing the front door and finding it locked, while his shorter companion moved around toward the side of the cabin, peering through windows with a small flashlight despite the daylight, clearly searching for any sign of what had drawn them to this property in the first place. When his light passed over the living room window and caught the three pups pressed together inside, watching him with wide, alert eyes, he went very still. "Hey," he called back to his partner, his voice carrying an excitement that made the pups instinctively shrink back from the glass. "Come look at this." The taller man joined him quickly, and both men studied the pups through the window with open fascination, clearly recognizing that wolf pups this size and this alert, cared for inside a human home, were far from ordinary. They exchanged a look between them, some silent understanding passing between two men who had traveled 200 miles, chasing rumors of exactly this kind of rare, valuable discovery. "Their mother's got to be around here somewhere," the taller man said, already moving back toward the front door with renewed determination. "Big as the rumors say, she'll want these pups back eventually. We wait here, she comes to us." It was the worst possible plan for anyone hoping to avoid confrontation with an enormous, grieving, and fiercely protective wolf, though neither man could have known just how catastrophic their reasoning was about to prove. The shorter man moved to break a window while his partner worked at the door lock with a small tool from his pocket, both of them focused entirely on the pups inside, and completely unprepared for what was already closing in on them from the tree line behind. Kane arrived at the edge of the clearing, just as the first pane of glass shattered under the shorter man's tool, the sound cutting through the quiet morning like a gunshot. Every instinct in his body roared toward pure, unrestrained fury at the sight of armed strangers breaking into the home where his children sheltered, but decades of experience, leading his pack through careful, strategic decisions, kept enough of his mind clear to recognize that a direct, reckless charge could easily end with his pups caught in the crossfire if the men reacted to a threat by raising their weapons toward the house instead of away from it. He circled wide instead, moving through the trees along the edge of the property, until he came up behind the men from an angle that put him between them and any clear line back toward their truck, cutting off their most obvious escape route before revealing himself at all. Only once he was fully positioned did he step out from the tree line, and even then, he did not charge immediately. He simply stood there, allowing his full, massive size to become visible, and let out a growl so low and so resonant that both men felt it in their chests before they consciously understood what was happening. The shorter man spun first, his flashlight beam catching Kane fully for just a moment before his hand began shaking too badly to hold it steady. What the beam revealed made both men freeze in place entirely. Every rumor, every exaggerated story passed between hunters about the size and presence of the creature they had traveled so far to find fell laughably short of the reality standing before them now. Kane's shoulders alone stood taller than the shorter man's waist, his golden eyes fixed on both intruders, with an intelligence that felt far more unsettling than simple animal aggression. And his low growl carried a warning so absolute that every survival instinct in both men's bodies screamed at them to run. The taller man, to his limited credit, tried to reach for the rifle slung across his back, but his hands shook too badly to manage it quickly, and before he could bring the weapon anywhere close to level, Kane closed the distance between them in a single powerful lunge, not attacking directly but placing himself bodily between the men and the cabin's broken window, his massive frame filling the space so completely that neither hunter could see any path forward that did not require going through him first. "Back away," the taller man said, his voice cracking despite his obvious attempt to sound commanding, finally managing to bring the rifle up, though his hands trembled visibly around it. "Back away, or I'll shoot." Kane did not retreat. He held his position, teeth bared, another warning growl rolling from deep in his chest, and something in the sheer, unwavering intensity of his stance made both men hesitate, despite the weapon now aimed in his direction. It was the shorter man who broke first, stumbling backward several steps, his earlier excitement about a valuable trophy completely replaced by pure, animal fear. "This isn't worth it," he said, his voice shaking as badly as his hands. "Put the rifle down, we're leaving." The taller man hesitated only a moment longer before lowering his weapon slightly, though he kept it aimed roughly in Kane's direction, as both men began backing away from the cabin toward the tree line where their truck was parked further down the service road. Kane held his ground, tracking their retreat with unwavering, watchful eyes, only fully relaxing his aggressive stance once both men had disappeared from sight, their hurried footsteps crashing through underbrush as they abandoned their careful stalking approach entirely, in favor of simply getting away. He listened to their truck engine roar to life moments later, tires spinning briefly in loose gravel, before the vehicle sped away down the dirt track, and only then did he allow himself to turn fully toward the cabin, toward the broken window where three small, wide-eyed faces stared out at him, with an expression caught somewhere between fear and dawning recognition. Frost was the first to press his small paws against the windowsill, a soft, eager whine escaping him, as he stared at Kane with an intensity that told Kane immediately his son somehow recognized him, even after weeks apart, even having grown up entirely within human walls with no memory of the den they had lost together. Birch and Ash joined their brother moments later, all three pups whining and pawing at the broken glass, and Kane felt something in his chest, something that had been frozen and grieving for weeks, finally begin to thaw. He moved closer to the window, careful of the broken glass, and lowered his massive head until he was eye level with his children for the first time since the storm had torn them apart. He let out a soft, low sound, nothing like the aggressive growl he had used against the hunters, something closer to the comforting rumble he remembered making when his pups were newborns and frightened by the smallest unfamiliar noise. All three pups responded immediately, pressing as close to the broken window as they could manage, small tails wagging, with a joy that told Kane, beyond any remaining doubt, that this reunion was every bit as significant to them as it was to him. He remained there for several long minutes, simply present with his children through the broken glass, memorizing the sight of them healthy and strong after weeks of believing he might never see them again. But he knew he could not stay indefinitely. Elena would return soon, and while some deep instinct told him she meant his pups no harm, whatever complicated feelings he still carried about the entire situation, he was not yet ready to reveal himself to her directly, not after everything that had just happened, not until he had time to think clearly about what came next. He backed away from the window slowly, reluctantly, his eyes lingering on his pups, until the tree line finally swallowed him from view, and he retreated to a distance where he could still watch the cabin without being seen, settling in to wait for Elena's return, determined now more than ever that he would not allow armed strangers, or anyone else, to threaten his family again without facing consequences far more severe than a warning growl. Elena arrived home nearly 2 hours later, her meeting with the ranger station having gone better than she expected, an officer promising to increase patrols through the area and investigate the two men she had described in detail. Her relief at that small victory evaporated instantly the moment she pulled into her driveway and saw the shattered living room window, glass scattered across the porch and ground below it. Her heart stopped. She was out of the car and running before she had fully processed what she was seeing, bursting through her front door, already calling out for the pups, terror closing her throat, until she heard three excited, healthy voices respond immediately. All three of them rushing toward her from where they had retreated to the far corner of the room, tails wagging, seemingly unharmed despite the obvious break-in. She checked each pup carefully, running trembling hands over their fur, finding no injuries at all, though her relief was quickly complicated by confusion about how exactly the break-in had happened, and, more importantly, how it had apparently failed. She examined the broken window closely, noting the glass had been shattered from the outside, clearly forced entry, and yet nothing inside had been disturbed, no sign that anyone had actually made it into the cabin at all. It was only when she stepped back outside to examine the area around the broken window more carefully that she found the answer, or at least the beginning of one. Massive paw prints, far larger than any she had documented before, covered the ground directly beneath the window, along with deep gouges in the soft earth that suggested a significant struggle or confrontation had taken place. Whatever had happened here, something enormous had clearly intervened before the intruders could finish what they started. Elena stood there for a long moment, staring at those tracks, piecing together a story she could not fully confirm but somehow understood completely. Something had protected her pups today, something large, powerful, and, judging by everything she had learned and suspected over the past several weeks, something that had far more personal a stake in their safety than any stranger's involvement could explain. She looked up toward the tree line, scanning the shadows with a new, different kind of attention than her earlier fear had carried, and though she saw nothing, she found herself speaking aloud into the quiet afternoon air, her voice steady, despite everything that had just happened. "Thank you," she said simply, not entirely certain if anyone, or anything, was close enough to hear her, but needing to say it anyway. Deep in the tree line, close enough to hear every word clearly, Kane lay watching her with golden eyes that had not left the cabin since her return, and something about the simple, genuine gratitude in her voice settled a question he had been wrestling with for weeks, far more effectively than any amount of careful, cautious deliberation ever could have. Whatever complicated path lay ahead of them, whatever difficult decisions still needed to be made about tradition, about belonging, about the strange, unlikely bond forming between a lone human caretaker and the grieving alpha of an entire forest, he understood now, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, that this woman was not an obstacle standing between him and his family. She had become, without either of them fully realizing it yet, something closer to an ally, and possibly, though he was not ready to examine the thought too closely just yet, something even more than that. In the days following the break-in, Elena replaced the broken window herself, working with tools she had not touched since her mother taught her basic repairs years earlier, but her mind stayed fixed the entire time on the massive tracks she had found and the presence she now felt certain was watching over her property, far more directly than she had previously believed. She no longer felt frightened when she sensed eyes on her from the tree line. Instead, she found herself searching the shadows deliberately, almost hoping for a clearer glimpse of whatever had driven off two armed men without harming a single hair on her pups. The pups themselves seemed different after that day, more confident, more settled, as if some deep uncertainty they had carried since the storm had finally been resolved. Frost in particular spent long stretches of each evening sitting at the window, not with the anxious, watchful posture he had shown before, but with something closer to patient anticipation, as though waiting for a visitor he fully expected to return. Elena began leaving the window unlatched at night, a small gesture she told herself was purely practical, allowing fresh air into the cabin, though she knew on some level she was leaving a deliberate invitation for something to approach closer than it had before. She continued her evening ritual of singing to the pups, though now she found herself singing a little louder, holding the notes a little longer, wondering if the sound carried as far into the forest as she now suspected it did. Nearly a week after the confrontation with the hunters, her patience was finally rewarded, though not in the way she expected. She had just finished the evening lullaby, the pups already drowsy and curled together near the fire, when she noticed movement through the newly repaired window, a shifting shadow at the edge of the tree line that resolved, as she watched with held breath, into the unmistakable shape of an enormous wolf, standing at the very edge of the clearing, no longer hidden fully in shadow the way it had always been before. Elena's heart pounded, but she did not move suddenly or make any noise that might startle the creature back into hiding. She simply sat very still, watching, as the massive wolf remained at the tree line, seemingly studying the cabin with the same patient intensity Frost so often displayed at the same window. Even from this distance, even in the fading evening light, she could make out golden eyes fixed directly on the cabin, and something about the way those eyes seemed to search the room, moving briefly over her before settling with clear, unmistakable focus on the three sleeping pups, told her everything she needed to understand about who, or what, she was truly looking at. She rose slowly from her seat by the fire, moving carefully toward the window, and the wolf's attention shifted immediately to track her movement, its powerful body tensing slightly, as if prepared to retreat the moment she gave any sign of alarm or aggression. Elena stopped a few feet from the glass, close enough to see the creature clearly now, close enough to recognize just how far beyond ordinary this animal truly was. His size alone was staggering, easily twice that of any wolf she had ever encountered in her years of wildlife work. His coat a deep, rich charcoal gray that seemed to absorb the last of the evening light rather than reflect it, and his eyes held an intelligence so clear and so present that it made her breath catch in her throat. "You're their father," she said quietly, not entirely sure if the words were a question or simply a statement of something she had already fully accepted as true. The wolf did not react in any way she could interpret with certainty, remaining perfectly still at the tree line, though something in the way his ears shifted slightly forward at the sound of her voice suggested, at least to her, that he understood her far more than any ordinary animal reasonably should. She stood there for a long, silent moment, neither of them moving, a strange kind of understanding passing between them despite the impossible gulf of species and language separating them. "They're safe here," she continued softly, holding his gaze without flinching, though every instinct told her she was speaking to something that could end her life in seconds if it chose to. "I promise you that. Whatever you are, whatever this is, I'm not trying to take them from you. I just want them to be okay." The wolf held her gaze for several more long seconds, and then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered his massive head in a gesture that felt unmistakably like acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude, before turning and disappearing back into the deepening shadows of the forest, leaving Elena standing alone at the window, with her heart still hammering, and 1,000 new questions crowding into her mind, alongside the strange, settled certainty that whatever this creature was, he meant her and the pups no harm at all. She did not sleep much that night, replaying the encounter over and over, trying to reconcile everything she thought she understood about wolves with what she had just witnessed. No ordinary animal held eye contact with that kind of deliberate, communicative intent. No ordinary animal responded to spoken words with a gesture so clearly meant to convey understanding. Whatever the true nature of the creature watching over her pups, she was now certain, beyond any remaining doubt, that the old stories about an alpha king ruling these woods carried far more truth in them than any local skeptic had ever wanted to admit. The following morning, she drove into Ashford Hollow again, this time not to report danger, but to seek out information. She visited the small local library, tucked into a converted storefront on the town's single main street, and spent hours combing through old regional records and folklore collections that the elderly librarian, a woman named Margaret who had lived in the area her entire life, pulled from dusty back shelves, with obvious curiosity about Elena's sudden interest in the subject. "You're not the first person to come asking about the Alpha King," Margaret told her, settling a thick, leather-bound collection of local history onto the table between them. "Every few years, someone gets curious enough to dig into the old stories. Most give up once they realize how little solid information actually exists." Elena spent the better part of the afternoon reading through faded accounts passed down from early settlers in the region. Stories of wolves far larger and far more intelligent than any recorded species should be. Stories describing bloodlines said to carry ancient strength and understanding, passed down through countless generations of leadership within the pack. Most of the accounts read like exaggerated folklore, the kind of tall tales meant to explain away large predator sightings or unusual animal behavior witnessed by frightened early settlers. But scattered throughout, Elena found smaller, more specific details that lined up unsettlingly well with everything she had personally observed. Descriptions of golden eyes, holding unnatural intelligence. Descriptions of these wolves showing deliberate, protective behavior toward humans who treated them, or their kin, with kindness. Descriptions, most strikingly of all, of these creatures responding specifically to music and song, drawn toward gentle, repeated melodies, in ways that ordinary wolves reportedly never displayed. She left the library that afternoon, with far more questions than answers, but with one thing settled firmly in her mind. Whatever she was dealing with, whatever ancient bloodline or unexplained intelligence had produced the massive wolf, now watching over her cabin, and the 3 remarkable pups inside it, she was no longer simply a caretaker who had stumbled into an unusual situation by accident. She had become, whether she fully understood it yet or not, part of something far older, and far more significant, than she ever could have imagined, when she first pulled 3 shivering pups from a flooding ravine. That evening, as she drove home through the lengthening shadows of early evening, her mind still full of everything she had read, she noticed a second vehicle parked along the main road leading toward her property, one she did not recognize, positioned in a way that suggested someone was watching the turnoff toward her cabin, rather than simply passing through. Her earlier sense of settled understanding evaporated instantly, replaced by the sharp, familiar spike of fear she had hoped was behind her after the hunter's retreat the previous week. She slowed her car as she approached, studying the vehicle carefully, and felt her stomach drop when she recognized the same dented rear bumper belonging to the truck the 2 hunters had driven days earlier. They had not given up after all. They had simply regrouped, and judging by the second, unfamiliar vehicle now parked beside their truck, they had returned with reinforcements. Elena did not drive straight home. Instead, she pulled her car onto a narrow side path she used occasionally to check the far end of her property line, cutting the engine and sitting in tense silence as she tried to decide her next move. 2 vehicles meant more than 2 men this time, and if the hunters had returned with reinforcements after their humiliating retreat the previous week, it likely meant they had come prepared with far more than simple determination. She thought immediately of the pups, alone in the cabin, and felt panic claw up her throat before she forced herself to breathe and think clearly. She reached for her phone and dialed the ranger station number she had been given during her earlier visit, relieved when the same officer who had taken her report answered after only 2 rings. She explained quickly what she was seeing, her voice tight with barely controlled urgency, and the officer promised to dispatch a patrol immediately, though he warned her honestly that the nearest available unit was at least 20 minutes out, given how remote her property sat from the main roads patrolled regularly. 20 minutes felt like an impossible amount of time to wait. Elena sat in her car, weighing her options, before deciding she could not simply remain hidden while strangers potentially closed in on her home and her pups. She eased the car back onto the main path, approaching her property from the rear service road instead of the main driveway, hoping to slip inside unnoticed while she waited for help to arrive. She managed to reach the cabin safely, relief flooding through her when she found all 3 pups exactly where she had left them, agitated and pacing near the windows but otherwise completely unharmed. She locked every door immediately, pulled curtains closed across every window, and gathered the pups close to her in the center of the living room, away from any direct line of sight from outside, her heart pounding as she strained to listen for any sound of approaching danger. She did not have to wait long. Voices carried faintly through the walls minutes later, at least 3 distinct male voices this time, moving closer along the tree line surrounding her property. She recognized the taller hunter's voice immediately, along with an unfamiliar deeper voice that sounded far more confident and commanding than either of the 2 men from the previous week, suggesting whoever had joined them this time held some position of authority within their group. "The wolf's got to be denning close by," the unfamiliar voice said, carrying clearly on the still evening air. "You said it came from this direction when it ran you off?" "Straight out of those trees," the taller hunter confirmed. "Biggest thing I've ever laid eyes on. Worth every bit of what you're paying. Trust me." Elena's blood ran cold at the confirmation of exactly what she had feared. These men were not simply passing through anymore. They had returned specifically to hunt the massive wolf that had driven them off before, and this time they had brought someone willing to pay significant money for the privilege of claiming him as a trophy. She held the pups closer, her mind racing through every possible option, knowing with sick certainty that if these men succeeded in locating and harming the creature who had protected her pups so fiercely just days earlier, the consequences would be devastating in ways that went far beyond simple wildlife conservation concerns. Outside, unseen by anyone inside the cabin, Kane had already picked up the scent of the approaching hunters from a considerable distance, the same sharp, unmistakable smell of gunpowder and human aggression that had alerted him to danger the previous week. This time, however, the scent carried an additional element that raised his alarm even further. A third, unfamiliar human scent, mixed with something else entirely, the distinct chemical smell of tranquilizer compounds, rather than simple ammunition, suggesting these men intended to capture, rather than immediately kill whatever they were hunting, a possibility that in some ways felt even more dangerous than a straightforward attack. He moved through the forest with careful, deliberate stealth, tracking the group's progress toward Elena's property, while simultaneously sending out a series of low, carrying howls meant to summon support from the rest of his pack, who he knew were patrolling territory not far from this section of the forest. Garrick's answering howl came back within minutes, along with several other pack members who began converging toward Kane's position, understanding immediately from the specific pattern of his call that this was not a routine summons but an urgent call to defend against direct human threat. By the time the three hunters reached the edge of the tree line bordering Elena's property, weapons raised and eyes scanning every shadow with practiced focus, they had no idea they were being watched, not by a single massive wolf, but by an entire coordinated pack, positioned carefully around their advance, with the kind of tactical precision that no ordinary predator group should have been capable of executing. The confrontation, when it came, unfolded with a speed and intensity that left the three hunters completely unprepared despite their weapons and their earlier confidence. Kane emerged first, directly in their path, his massive size and unmistakable presence exactly matching every exaggerated story the hunters had chased across 200 miles to verify. But before any of them could raise their weapons in response, 4 additional wolves emerged simultaneously from the surrounding tree line, flanking the group on every side, cutting off any possible retreat, while Kane held their attention directly ahead. The unfamiliar third man, clearly the wealthy client the other 2 hunters had been guiding, dropped his tranquilizer rifle entirely in his panic, stumbling backward into one of his companions, as the full scope of what they had walked into became terrifyingly clear. This was not a single, isolated predator they could overwhelm with numbers and firepower. This was an organized, intelligent pack that had anticipated their approach and positioned itself with deliberate strategic advantage, before they had even realized they were the ones being hunted, rather than the reverse. "Nobody move," the taller hunter said, his voice shaking despite the obvious attempt at command, his rifle raised, but wavering, as his eyes darted between the wolves surrounding them on every side. "Everybody just stay calm." Kane took a single, deliberate step forward, his growl rolling out low and absolute, and the message could not have been clearer if he had spoken actual words. This was his territory, his family, and his patience for armed intrusion had run out entirely. The wealthy client, sobbing now with pure terror, began begging his guides to do whatever was necessary to get them out alive, offering to abandon the entire hunt, offering money, offering anything at all if the wolves would simply let them leave. It was at that exact moment that the flashing lights of an approaching ranger vehicle finally appeared along the main road, its arrival timed with a coincidence that felt almost providential, given how close the confrontation had already come to catastrophic violence on either side. The sudden sound of an approaching vehicle, and the ranger's authoritative voice calling out warnings as he approached on foot, created enough distraction and confusion that Kane made a swift, calculated decision, backing away just enough to open a path toward the road, while his pack members held their flanking positions a moment longer, ensuring the terrified hunters had no choice but to retreat directly toward the approaching official, rather than risk any further confrontation with the wolves. The ranger arrived to find 3 visibly shaken men stumbling out of the tree line, weapons abandoned entirely, babbling incoherently about a wolf pack unlike anything they had ever encountered, while whatever animals had frightened them so thoroughly had already vanished back into the deepening forest shadows without a trace. He radioed for backup immediately, more out of confusion about the men's frantic story than any real belief he would find dangerous wildlife still lingering nearby, and began the process of citing all 3 men for trespassing and illegal hunting activity. A process that would eventually result in significant fines and a permanent ban from ever entering the protected forest lands again. Elena watched the entire aftermath from her cabin window, having finally allowed herself to breathe again once the ranger's arrival signaled the immediate danger had passed. She did not see Kane or his pack retreat, could not have known the tactical precision with which they had handled the confrontation, but she understood with absolute certainty. watching three thoroughly terrified men being questioned by the ranger outside her property line, that whatever had happened in those woods moments earlier had ended in her favor, and in the favor of the massive, grieving father, who had clearly decided, once and for all, that he would defend this cabin and everyone inside it against any threat that dared approach again. Later that night, once the ranger had finally departed and the property had settled back into quiet darkness, Elena sat by the fire with the pups finally calm and drowsy beside her, and found herself once again glancing toward the window, searching the tree line for any sign of the creature who had twice now protected her pups from serious harm. She did not expect to see him again so soon after such an intense confrontation, but as she began humming the familiar notes of her mother's old lullaby, softer than usual, exhaustion finally catching up with her after the day's terror, she caught the faintest glimpse of golden eyes watching from the shadows, closer to the cabin than he had ever positioned himself before, and something about his presence in that moment felt less like careful, distant observation, and more like a deliberate choice to stay close, to remain within reach, should any further danger ever threaten the family he had clearly decided, in every way that mattered, was still fully his own. In the weeks following the second confrontation with the hunters, life around the small cabin settled into something Elena could almost have called peaceful, though peaceful now carried an entirely different meaning than it had before she pulled three shivering pups from a flooded ravine. She no longer startled at every sound from the tree line. She no longer felt the need to check locks and windows obsessively before settling in for the evening. Instead, she found herself watching for golden eyes in the shadows, with something closer to anticipation than fear. And more often than not, especially in the quiet hour after her nightly lullaby, she found them waiting there. Kane's visits grew steadily closer over those weeks, his caution easing in slow, deliberate increments that Elena recognized as trust being built one careful step at a time. He no longer retreated the moment she noticed him. Some evenings, he would remain at the tree line for nearly an hour, simply watching the cabin, watching his pups tumble and play in the yard under Elena's supervision, his massive presence radiating a calm, protective patience that no longer frightened her in the slightest. The pups, for their part, had begun openly acknowledging him during these visits, something Elena found both moving and slightly unsettling in how naturally it seemed to unfold. Birch and Ash would abandon their play the moment they caught his scent, bounding toward the tree line with excited yips before Elena could even call them back, and though Kane never fully emerged from the shadows during daylight hours, he would meet them part way, allowing brief, joyful reunions before nudging them gently back toward the cabin and the safety it represented. Frost, always the most perceptive of the three, seemed to understand something about the delicate balance being maintained between his father and his caretaker that his siblings had not yet grasped. He often sat between Elena and the tree line during these visits, glancing back and forth between them, as though trying to bridge some gap he sensed but could not fully articulate, and Elena found herself wondering more than once whether the pups, in their own instinctive way, were quietly working to draw the two of them together. It happened, finally, on an evening in early autumn, when the air had begun carrying the first genuine chill of the changing season, and the light lasted just a little less long each day. Elena had stepped outside after the evening feeding to gather firewood from the small stack near the side of the cabin, and as she straightened with an armful of logs, she found Kane standing at the very edge of her yard, closer than he had ever come during any of their previous encounters, close enough that the porch light caught the full, undeniable scale of him clearly for the first time. She froze for a moment, the firewood forgotten in her arms, and studied him properly, in a way the darkness of their earlier encounters had never fully allowed. Up close, he was even more impressive than she had realized, his coat a rich, deep charcoal that seemed to hold subtle silver undertones where the porch light caught it, his frame powerful and lean in the way of a creature built for both strength and speed. But it was his eyes that held her attention most completely, golden and clear and carrying an unmistakable weight of intelligence and emotion that no ordinary animal should have been capable of expressing so plainly. "You're closer tonight," she said softly, setting the firewood down carefully so as not to make any sudden movement that might startle him back into the shadows. "Is everything all right?" Kane held her gaze steadily, and after a long moment, he did something he had never done before in any of their previous encounters. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, out of the tree line entirely, into the open yard, where the fading evening light illuminated him fully. Elena's breath caught, but she did not move away. Some deep instinct, telling her that retreating now, after weeks of carefully building trust, would undo everything they had established between them. He crossed the remaining distance slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she chose to, until he stood only a few feet away, close enough that she could see the fine details of his fur, close enough to notice a faint, old scar along one shoulder that spoke of past battles she could only imagine. He lowered his massive head slightly, not in submission exactly, but in something that felt distinctly like a gesture of respect, and Elena found herself reaching out slowly, hesitantly, before resting her hand gently against the side of his face. The contact sent a strange warmth through her chest, an overwhelming sense of connection that felt entirely disproportionate to the simple physical gesture, as though some deeper understanding passed between them in that quiet moment beneath the darkening sky. Kane remained perfectly still beneath her touch, his golden eyes never leaving hers, and for the first time since she had found his pups in that flooded ravine, Elena felt with absolute certainty that whatever this creature truly was, whatever ancient bloodline or unexplained intelligence had produced him, he was, in every way that mattered, capable of genuine trust, genuine gratitude, and something that felt remarkably close to genuine affection. "Thank you for protecting them," she said quietly, her hand still resting against his fur. "And for protecting me too, I think." Kane made a low sound in response, softer than any growl she had heard from him before, almost a sigh, and leaned very slightly into her touch, before finally stepping back, breaking the contact gently, rather than abruptly. He glanced toward the cabin, where all three pups now watched the exchange from the window with wide, attentive eyes, and then back toward Elena, and something in his expression felt unmistakably like gratitude, mixed with a question he had no way of voicing aloud. From that evening forward, their nightly encounters changed in a way that felt both natural and profound. Kane no longer remained at a cautious distance. He would approach the cabin openly most evenings, allowing Elena to sit near him while she watched the pups play, sometimes resting his massive head near her feet, while she continued her quiet observations in her journal, his presence steady and warm beside her, in a way she found herself looking forward to more each passing day. She began talking to him during these visits, not expecting any response beyond his attentive, intelligent silence, but finding comfort in voicing thoughts she had kept to herself since her mother's passing years earlier. She told him about her mother, about the small rescue center she had inherited and worked so hard to maintain, about the quiet loneliness that had settled over her life in the years since she had been running the property entirely on her own. Kane listened to every word with an attentiveness that felt almost human, and though he could never respond in words she could understand, the gentle, understanding sounds he made in response, along with the steady comfort of his presence, told her more clearly than any words could have, that he understood far more than she ever expected any wild creature to comprehend. Not everyone within Kane's world shared his growing comfort with this unlikely bond, however. Garrick, who had supported Kane's cautious surveillance of the cabin in its earlier stages, grew increasingly troubled as reports filtered back to him about his leader's changing behavior, about visits that had evolved from careful observation into something that looked, to more traditional members of the pack, uncomfortably close to genuine companionship with a human. He confronted Kane directly one evening, tracking him partway toward Elena's property before intercepting him at the edge of their shared territory, his expression carrying a mixture of concern and disapproval that he did not attempt to hide. "This has gone far beyond simply watching over the pups," Garrick said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine worry rather than simple criticism. "You spend nearly every evening at that cabin now. The pack has noticed. Some are beginning to question your judgment." Kane's expression hardened slightly at the implied criticism, though he recognized the honest concern underlying Garrick's words. "The woman has kept my children alive and safe through threats that nearly cost them everything," he said finally. "I owe her more than simple gratitude for that." "Gratitude is one thing," Garrick pressed, unwilling to let the matter drop so easily. "What you are building with her is something else entirely, and you know it as well as I do. Our kind and humans have never mixed, not successfully, not without eventual tragedy for one side or the other. I fear where this path leads, Kane, more than I have feared anything since we lost your mate." The mention of his lost mate struck Kane harder than Garrick likely intended, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, staring out toward the direction of Elena's cabin, with an expression that carried far more complexity than simple defensiveness. He understood Garrick's concerns were rooted in genuine care for both Kane's well-being and the stability of the pack he led, and he could not entirely dismiss the validity of centuries of tradition, warning against exactly the kind of bond he found himself building. "I do not yet know where this leads," he admitted finally, his voice quieter than Garrick had heard it in a long while. "But I know that woman has done nothing but protect and care for my children since the moment she found them, at real risk to herself, more than once. Whatever tradition demands, I cannot simply abandon that debt, or dismiss what has grown from it, without at least understanding it fully first." Garrick studied him for a long moment, clearly unsatisfied with the answer, but recognizing the futility of pressing further, while Kane remained so firmly resolved. "Just be careful," he said finally, turning to head back toward the heart of their territory. "Not every member of this pack will extend you the same patience I have shown while you work through this. If this continues, you may find yourself needing to choose between the woman and the pack's confidence in your leadership, and I do not envy you that choice should it come." Kane watched him go, Garrick's warning settling uneasily in his chest, alongside everything else he had been quietly working through over the past several weeks. He knew, on some level, that the warning carried real weight, that pack politics and ancient tradition rarely bent easily to individual circumstance, no matter how compelling that circumstance might be. But as he turned his attention back toward Elena's cabin, toward the warm light glowing steadily through her windows, and the sound of her voice, already beginning the evening's lullaby, carrying softly on the night air, he found he could not bring himself to regret a single moment of the bond that had grown between them, whatever difficulties still lay ahead because of it. The opportunity for that trust to extend beyond just Kane himself arrived sooner than either of them expected, and in a way that neither could have anticipated when the season had begun. It was a cold, clear night, nearly a week after Garrick's warning, and Elena had just finished settling the pups for sleep when an unfamiliar sound reached her from outside, distinct from anything she had heard before during Kane's visits. A pained, labored breathing, low and struggling, carrying from somewhere near the tree line, with an urgency that made her set down her journal immediately and hurry to the window. What she found through the glass made her heart lurch. Kane stood at the edge of the clearing as usual, but beside him lay another wolf, smaller and clearly injured. One foreleg held awkwardly against its body, while dark patches stained the fur along its side. Kane's posture radiated urgency, entirely different from his usual calm, patient presence, and the moment he caught Elena's eye through the window, he made a sound she had never heard from him before, an unmistakable plea, rather than any kind of greeting. Elena did not hesitate. She grabbed her medical supplies from the small closet where she kept equipment for the rescue center's animals, and hurried outside without stopping to consider the risk of approaching an injured, unfamiliar wolf, who might react unpredictably to pain and fear. Kane met her halfway across the yard, positioning himself protectively beside his injured pack member, and something in his posture, calm but watchful, seemed to communicate clearly that he trusted her enough to allow this, that he had brought this wounded creature to her, specifically because he believed, without any remaining doubt, that she could help. The injured wolf, a young female Elena did not recognize, watched her approach with wary, pain-filled eyes, but did not attempt to retreat or lash out, her exhaustion and injury apparently too severe to allow much resistance, even if fear urged her otherwise. Elena knelt carefully beside her, speaking in the same soft, steady tone she used with every frightened animal that came through her rescue center, and began a careful examination of the wound along the wolf's side, finding what appeared to be a deep gash, likely from barbed wire or some similar hazard, along with a foreleg that seemed fractured rather than simply bruised. "This needs cleaning and stitching," Elena said quietly, glancing up at Kane, who watched the entire examination with intense, focused attention. "And her leg will need to be set properly, or it won't heal correctly. I can do this, but I'll need you both to trust me completely, and I'll need her to stay still, which is going to be difficult given how much pain she's in." Kane moved closer immediately, lowering himself beside the injured wolf and pressing his body gently against hers, in a clear gesture of comfort and reassurance. The young wolf's tense posture eased slightly at his presence, and Elena took that as her signal to begin. Working quickly, and carefully by lantern light, cleaning the wound thoroughly before beginning the delicate process of stitching it closed. The wolf whimpered and flinched throughout the procedure, but Kane's steady presence beside her, along with occasional soft, comforting sounds he made throughout, seemed to keep her calm enough for Elena to complete the work without serious complication. Setting the fractured leg proved more difficult, requiring Elena to apply firm, careful pressure while the wolf's whole body tensed against the pain. But between Kane's steady reassurance and Elena's practiced hands, the procedure was completed successfully within another 20 minutes. The leg properly splinted with materials Elena kept on hand for exactly this kind of emergency treatment. By the time she finished, exhaustion had settled heavily over all three of them, human and wolves alike, but the young wolf's breathing had eased considerably, her pain visibly reduced now that the wound was properly treated and the fracture stabilized. Elena sat back on her heels, wiping her hands clean, and found Kane watching her, with an expression that carried more open gratitude than she had seen from him in any of their previous encounters. "She'll need to stay still and rest for the wound to heal properly," Elena said, addressing both of them, though only Kane could fully understand her words. "I can check on her tomorrow if you bring her back this way, or I could set up space in the barn if she needs somewhere safe and warm to recover." Kane considered this for a long moment, before making a decision that surprised Elena entirely. Rather than simply carrying the injured wolf back toward pack territory, he nosed her gently toward the direction of Elena's barn, clearly communicating his preference that she remain under Elena's continued care, while she recovered from injuries serious enough that a difficult journey back to more distant pack territory might risk complications. The young wolf, though clearly wary of remaining so close to human structures, seemed to trust Kane's judgment enough to allow herself to be guided toward the shelter without further resistance. Elena spent the following week caring for the injured wolf, whom she began calling Willow for lack of any better name, alongside her continued care of the three pups, and found the experience deeply moving, in ways she had not fully anticipated. Willow remained wary of her presence at first, understandably given the pain and vulnerability of her situation, but as days passed and her wound began healing properly under Elena's careful attention, that wariness gradually eased into something closer to cautious acceptance, and eventually, something that felt remarkably like genuine trust. Kane visited daily throughout Willow's recovery, checking on her progress with obvious relief as her condition improved, and Elena noticed during these visits that his behavior toward her had shifted again, subtly but unmistakably. He no longer simply tolerated her presence or appreciated her care for his pups. He had begun treating her, in every meaningful way, as someone worthy of the kind of deep trust normally reserved only for members of his own pack, someone he now relied upon not just for his own children's safety, but for the well-being of others under his protection as well. This expanding circle of trust did not go unnoticed within the broader pack, however, and word of an injured pack member being treated and sheltered by a human spread quickly among wolves who had already grown uneasy about Kane's increasingly close relationship with Elena. Garrick arrived at the edge of Elena's property himself, nearly a week after Willow's injury, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of relief at Willow's obvious recovery and deepening concern about exactly what this development signified for the pack's future relationship with humans in general. He found Kane resting near the barn, where Willow continued her recovery, and the conversation that followed carried far more tension than their previous exchange had shown. "The pack is talking," Garrick said without preamble, his gaze moving briefly toward the cabin where Elena could be seen through the window, tending to the three pups' evening meal. "Not just about your visits anymore, but about Willow being brought here, about a human treating one of our own as though this were somehow an acceptable, ordinary arrangement." "She saved Willow's leg," Kane replied evenly, though a hint of defensive tension had crept into his voice. "Perhaps her life as well, if that wound had been left untreated much longer. Would you have preferred I refused that help out of stubborn adherence to tradition?" "I would have preferred you handled Willow's injury through our own means, as our kind always has," Garrick said, though his tone carried less conviction than his words suggested, as if he too recognized the limitations of that traditional approach when faced with an injury this severe. "Kane, I understand the debt you feel toward this woman. I even understand, though I struggle with it, whatever this bond has become between you personally. But you are not simply an individual free to make these choices without consequence. You lead this entire pack, Every choice you make ripples outward into decisions the rest of us must eventually make as well. Kane fell silent at this, recognizing the weight of truth in Garrick's words, even as every instinct in him rebelled against the idea of stepping back from the bond he had built with Elena, or from the safety and care she had provided, not just for his pups, but now for Willow as well. He glanced toward the cabin, watching Elena's silhouette moving gently between the three pups as she finished their evening meal, and felt the full complexity of his position settle over him with a weight he had been trying, for weeks now, to avoid fully confronting. "Give me time," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. "I do not yet know how to resolve what tradition demands against what my own judgment tells me is right in this particular situation. But I will not simply abandon her, or dismiss the debt owed to her, without far more consideration than a hasty decision made purely out of concern for pack politics." Garrick studied him for a long moment, clearly torn between his loyalty to Kane and his genuine worry about where this path might lead, before finally nodding once, a reluctant acceptance rather than full agreement. "Take your time," he said, "but do not take too much of it. Others within the pack are far less patient than I am, and far less willing to extend you the benefit of doubt should this situation continue much longer without clear resolution." He turned and disappeared back into the forest, leaving Kane alone with his thoughts and the quiet, steady sounds of Elena's evening routine drifting from the cabin nearby. He knew, with growing certainty, that Garrick's warning carried real weight, that whatever peaceful balance he had managed to build over these past weeks could not continue indefinitely without eventually forcing a genuine reckoning between the traditions that had guided his entire life and the unexpected, deeply meaningful bond that had grown, against every expectation, between himself and the woman who had saved his children's lives. The reckoning Garrick had warned of arrived faster than Kane expected, and it arrived in a form far more dangerous than simple disapproving whispers among pack members. Nearly 2 weeks after Willow's recovery had progressed enough for her to return safely to pack territory, a wolf named Draven, one of the pack's most senior and traditionally minded members, began openly challenging Kane's judgment during pack gatherings, his objections growing bolder and more pointed with each passing day, as Kane's evening visits to Elena's cabin continued without any sign of the resolution Garrick had urged him to find. Draven had never fully accepted Kane's leadership in the years since Kane had first risen to lead the pack, tolerating his authority mainly because Kane's strength and strategic leadership had proven undeniably effective in protecting and expanding their territory. But the current situation, in Draven's view, represented exactly the kind of weakness he had always privately suspected lurked beneath Kane's impressive exterior, a dangerous softness toward humans that threatened the safety and traditions of the entire pack. "He grieves for his mate by running to a human for comfort," Draven argued, during one particularly heated gathering, his voice carrying easily to the assembled pack members who had come to discuss growing concerns about their leader's behavior. "He brings our wounded to be treated in human hands rather than trusting our own healing traditions. How long before he decides our pups should all be raised inside human walls rather than among their own kind? How long before this pack exists only at the mercy of whatever human happens to earn our leader's misplaced affection?" Garrick, present at this gathering, attempted to defend Kane's judgment, reminding the assembled pack of everything Elena had done, the pups saved from certain death in the flood, the hunters driven off not once but twice, Willow's leg and life saved through her medical treatment. But Draven's arguments found fertile ground among pack members who had grown genuinely uneasy watching their leader's behavior shift so dramatically over recent months, and by the gathering's end, a faction had formed, small but vocal, questioning openly whether Kane remained fit to lead them, given his apparent inability to maintain proper boundaries with a human who, whatever her individual kindness, still represented a species that had brought nothing but danger and loss to their kind throughout countless generations of painful history. Word of this growing dissent reached Kane through Garrick, who delivered the news with visible reluctance, understanding fully the difficult position his warning now placed his old friend in. Kane listened in tense silence, recognizing immediately that this represented a far more serious threat than simple disapproval. A genuine challenge to his leadership, if it gained enough support among the pack, could destabilize everything he had worked to build and protect over years of careful, strategic leadership, threatening not just his personal situation, but the safety and cohesion of the entire pack he had sworn to protect. Draven has never wanted my leadership, Kane said finally, pacing restlessly as he processed everything Garrick had told him. This situation has simply given him the opening he has waited years to find. Perhaps, Garrick agreed carefully. But that does not make his concerns entirely without merit. Even if his motivations are less than pure, you must decide soon, Kane. And decide clearly, or Draven will make the decision for you. And I fear what that might mean for the pack's stability, and for the woman and pups you have grown so attached to protecting. That warning proved tragically prophetic within days. Draven, growing impatient with Kane's continued hesitation to address the situation decisively, took matters into his own hands, in a way that threatened to shatter everything Kane had carefully built. Gathering a small group of like-minded pack members who shared his concerns, Draven led them toward Elena's property under cover of darkness, intending, as he explained to his followers, to force a resolution to the situation by removing the source of the pack's division entirely, driving Elena away from the territory permanently through intimidation severe enough that she would abandon the cabin and the pups along with it, believing this drastic action necessary to restore proper order and traditional boundaries before Kane's misguided attachment could cause any further damage to pack unity. Elena had no warning of the danger approaching that night. She had settled the pups for sleep as usual and sat by the fire finishing her evening journal entries when an unfamiliar chorus of growls and snarling erupted from just beyond her fence line, far more aggressive and threatening than anything she had heard during any of Kane's visits. She hurried to the window, heart pounding, and found herself staring at a group of 5 wolves positioned aggressively at the edge of her property, their postures radiating hostility entirely different from the calm, protective presence she had grown accustomed to associating with Kane and his pack. The pups woke immediately, sensing the danger through instinct even before fully understanding its source, and pressed close together near Elena, all 3 of them trembling as the unfamiliar wolves' aggressive growling continued to build outside. Elena's mind raced through her options, recognizing immediately that this represented an entirely different kind of threat than the human hunters she had faced before, one she had no clear strategy for handling given her complete lack of understanding about wolfpack politics and hierarchy. It was Frost who reacted first, moving to the window with a growl of his own, small but fierce, clearly recognizing on some instinctive level that these wolves represented danger rather than the familiar, protective presence of their father. Birch and Ash joined him moments later, all 3 pups pressed against the glass, their combined defensive posture both moving and utterly inadequate against the very real threat gathering outside. Draven, watching from beyond the fence line, addressed the cabin directly, in a series of aggressive howls and growls that carried unmistakable menace, even without words Elena could understand, his message clear enough through tone and posture alone. Leave this territory, abandon this place. The pups belong with their own kind, and your presence here threatens the stability of an entire pack that has tolerated your involvement in their affairs for far too long already. Elena grabbed her phone with shaking hands, though she recognized immediately the futility of calling for human help against a threat like this, one that no ranger or police officer could reasonably be expected to handle even if they arrived in time. She set the phone down, and instead did the only thing she could think to do, moving to the door and stepping onto the porch despite every instinct screaming at her to remain hidden inside, determined to at least attempt some kind of direct communication, rather than simply cowering while the pups she loved faced a threat she felt powerless to address. "I'm not trying to take anything from your pack," she called out, her voice trembling, but carrying clearly across the tense distance separating her from the aggressive group of wolves. "I only want them safe. That's all this has ever been about." Draven's response was an aggressive step forward, his growl deepening into something far more threatening, and Elena felt genuine fear grip her chest as she realized her words, however sincere, meant absolutely nothing to a creature operating entirely on instinct and territorial aggression, rather than any capacity for the kind of reasoned understanding Kane had shown her. It was at this exact moment, with Draven poised to advance further, and Elena standing exposed and vulnerable on her own porch, that a howl unlike any Elena had heard before tore through the night air, deep and commanding, and carrying an absolute authority that made every wolf in Draven's group freeze instantly in place. Kane emerged from the tree line moments later, moving with a speed and ferocity Elena had never witnessed from him before. positioning himself directly between Draven's group and the cabin, with a posture that radiated pure, unmistakable dominance. What followed was a confrontation conducted entirely in the language of posture, growl, and challenge that Elena could not fully interpret, but understood instinctively carried enormous weight and consequence. Kane's growl toward Draven carried a fury she had never seen from him, and Draven, despite his earlier bold confidence, visibly hesitated in the face of his leader's direct, furious challenge, his followers shifting uneasily behind him as the true scale of Kane's anger became unmistakably clear. "You dare threaten them?" Kane's posture and voice seemed to communicate. Even without words, Elena could translate directly. "In my presence, in defiance of everything I have already decided about their protection." Draven, to his limited credit, did not back down entirely, holding his ground, despite Kane's obvious fury, his own posture carrying the desperate conviction of someone who genuinely believed, however misguidedly, that he was acting in the pack's best interest, rather than simply seeking personal advancement through Kane's potential downfall. The tension between the two wolves stretched unbearably, Elena watching from the porch with her heart in her throat, uncertain whether this confrontation was about to erupt into serious, potentially fatal violence between two powerful creatures locked in a battle over leadership and tradition that went far beyond her own individual circumstance. It was Garrick's arrival, moments later, that finally broke the unbearable standoff, the old wolf moving quickly to position himself beside Kane, his presence adding weight and legitimacy to Kane's challenge that Draven's smaller group of followers could not easily dismiss or overcome. Faced now with both Kane's fury and Garrick's clear, unwavering support for their leader, Draven's remaining resolve finally crumbled, his posture shifting from aggressive challenge into something closer to reluctant, humiliated submission. Kane held his dominant position for several more long, tense moments, ensuring the message had been fully absorbed, before finally allowing his posture to ease slightly, though his growl toward Draven carried a final, unmistakable warning that needed no translation for Elena to understand its meaning entirely. This would not happen again. Whatever tradition demanded, whatever concerns existed within the pack about his choices, the safety of this cabin, and everyone inside it, was no longer open for challenge or debate among his own followers. Draven and his small group retreated into the darkness moments later, thoroughly defeated and clearly understanding that any further challenge to Kane's authority regarding this matter would carry consequences far more severe than simple disapproval. Garrick remained a moment longer, exchanging a long, understanding look with Kane, before he too disappeared back into the forest, leaving Kane alone in the yard, with Elena still standing frozen on her porch, 3 terrified pups pressed against the door behind her. Kane turned toward her slowly, his fury visibly draining away into something closer to exhaustion and lingering concern, and crossed the distance between them until he stood directly before her, close enough that she could see the tension still radiating through his powerful frame. Elena, trembling from the adrenaline of everything she had just witnessed, reached out instinctively and pressed her hand against his chest, feeling his heart still pounding rapidly beneath her palm. "You saved us again," she said quietly, her voice shaking with the aftermath of fear and overwhelming relief combined. "Thank you. Doesn't feel like enough anymore." Kane leaned into her touch, a low, weary sound rumbling from deep in his chest, and Elena understood without any need for words that whatever internal battle he had been fighting for weeks, about tradition, about pack loyalty, about the complicated bond that had grown between them, had just been resolved decisively and permanently in her favor, regardless of whatever difficulties that decision might still bring upon him within his own world. The days following the confrontation with Draven passed with a different kind of quiet than Elena had known before, not the uneasy quiet of waiting for danger to arrive, but the settled, peaceful quiet of a threat finally, fully resolved. Word spread quickly throughout the pack about what had happened that night, about Kane's decisive, unwavering defense of the cabin and everyone inside it, and whatever quiet dissent had gathered around Draven's earlier arguments dissolved almost entirely in the face of such clear, unambiguous demonstration of their leader's resolve. Draven himself did not challenge Kane's authority again. He remained within the pack, his position diminished considerably by the humiliation of his failed challenge, but Kane, in a decision that surprised even Garrick, chose not to banish him entirely, recognizing that whatever misguided methods Draven had chosen, His underlying concern for the pack's traditions and stability came from a place that, while flawed in execution, was not entirely without value in principle. Cain simply made clear, through both words and action in the days that followed, that he intended to lead the pack forward, according to his own judgment, one that now firmly included the woman who had proven herself, beyond any remaining doubt, as trustworthy and protective toward his family as any member of his own pack could have been. Garrick, for his part, found himself increasingly won over by everything he had witnessed, not just Cain's fierce defense of Elena and the pups, but the deep, genuine bond that had clearly grown between them over these past months. He began visiting the cabin himself on occasion, cautiously at first, observing Elena's continued gentle care for the pups and, on one particularly memorable evening, allowing her to check a minor injury on his own paw after a difficult hunt, an act of trust that spoke volumes about how far the pack's relationship with Elena had evolved from the tense uncertainty of those early weeks. The pups themselves continued growing at their remarkable pace, and as autumn deepened into the first frost of early winter, Birch, Ash, and Frost had grown into young wolves nearly capable of managing on their own, though they remained deeply attached to both Elena's gentle care and their father's steady, protective presence. Elena found herself facing questions she had not fully anticipated when she first pulled 3 shivering pups from that flooded ravine, questions about what their future actually looked like, about whether they belonged, ultimately, within the wild pack structure their father led, or within the safe, human-adjacent life she had built for them over these transformative months. It was Cain, in the end, who helped resolve that uncertainty, in a manner that honored both the traditions he had spent his entire life upholding and the new, unprecedented bond he had built with a human who had proven herself an irreplaceable part of his family's story. He began, gradually, introducing the pups to the wider pack, allowing them supervised visits to observe pack life, to learn the skills and traditions that would eventually serve them well should they choose to fully embrace their wild heritage, while still returning each evening to Elena's cabin, where they continued sleeping curled together near the fire, lulled each night by the same gentle lullaby that had first drawn their father out of grief-stricken isolation months earlier. Elena, watching this careful balance unfold, understood that she was witnessing something entirely unprecedented, a genuine blending of 2 worlds that tradition on both sides had long insisted could never successfully coexist. She continued running her small rescue center, continued caring for injured and orphaned animals brought to her from across the region, but her life now included something far richer and more meaningful than the quiet, solitary existence she had known before that fateful storm. On a clear evening in early winter, nearly 6 months after she had first pulled 3 pups from the flooded ravine, Elena sat on her porch, watching Cain and his 3 now nearly grown children moving together at the edge of the tree line, the pups practicing hunting techniques under their father's patient guidance, while Elena observed with quiet, deep satisfaction. Garrick sat nearby as well, having become a regular, welcome presence around the property over recent weeks, and even Willow, fully healed now, occasionally visited alongside the others, her leg showing no lasting effects from the injury Elena had treated so many months earlier. Cain eventually made his way back toward the porch once the evening's lessons concluded, settling beside Elena with the easy familiarity that had grown between them over these transformative months. She rested her hand against his fur, watching the pups continue playing together in the fading evening light, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for everything the storm had unexpectedly brought into her life, despite the danger and uncertainty that had accompanied it. "They're going to be all right, aren't they?" she said quietly, more a statement of settled confidence than an actual question requiring an answer. Cain made a low, contented sound in response, leaning gently against her side, and Elena understood, with complete certainty, that whatever unconventional family they had built together across the boundaries of species and tradition alike, it was one worth every difficult moment that had led them to this quiet, peaceful evening. The pups that had once been 3 shivering, orphaned creatures pulled from a raging flood had grown strong and confident, protected fiercely by both their powerful father and the gentle woman who had never once hesitated to save them, and the bond between all of them, forged through danger, patience, and unexpected trust, promised to remain unbroken for as long as any of them walked beneath these ancient northern trees. As the last light faded from the sky, and the first stars began appearing overhead, Elena began humming softly once more, the same old lullaby that had first carried her voice out into a grieving father's desperate, listening ears, all those months earlier, and Cain settled more fully against her side, his eyes closing in the same peaceful contentment that had settled over his 3 remarkable children playing together nearby, a family reunited and remade, stronger and more unexpected than any of them could have imagined on the night a violent storm first brought them all irrevocably together.